Hello to everybody. This is Gwen Hines, Chief Executive of Save the Children here in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us for what should be a really important and interesting and inspiring panel this evening. Very much appreciate you taking the time to join us. Before I kick off, can I just give you a couple of words of housekeeping to everybody? Firstly, this is a joint event we're doing with Oxfam to follow up the report we did together on dangerous delays 10 years on, about how the world said last time when we were faced with terrible famines that we should act quicker, but we're not acting quicker, and that's very much the subject of today's discussion. So delighted to be doing this in partnership with Oxfam. Please submit any questions you have for the discussion we're going to have via the Q&A box. You should be seeing it on your screen. And as this is designed to raise attention, I would encourage you to use social media. The hashtag is Hungry for Action. And also we'll share the Oxfam and Save the Children Twitter handles for anyone who isn't aware of them. So to come back to the purpose of today, we're here to talk about a really important issue that means so much. We've literally got children and families struggling with hunger around the world. It's an unprecedented situation with the scale of the crisis that we're seeing. And yet it's not cutting through because, of course, the world's attention is on many other issues, not least the horrible conflict in Ukraine. But to Save the Children, we believe that all children matter wherever they are, and we need to act to support them with the hunger, with the hardship they're facing. And this is something we're very much working on together in partnership with Oxfam, with other international charities. You're hearing the UN, you're hearing governments talk about this, and yet we're not seeing the global action we should be to support the children and families who need help right now. So the point of today is how and where can the UK show leadership on this crisis? But I'm also joined by some fantastic panelists who will give us their perspective on what's happening and why action isn't happening, and then you'll get a chance to have discussions with them. I'm delighted that we will be joined by Rory Stewart. He's actually done a pre-recorded interview because he's traveling at the moment. But well known to many of you as a voice on international affairs, a former Secretary of State, and now a podcast star as well, for anyone who hasn't found that yet. We've also got Sir Mark Lowcock, who's given a lifetime of public service on humanitarian causes, not least as Permanent Secretary at the UK Department for International Development, and my former boss. Also his time in the UN as the Emergency Coordinator, and very much writing on these issues now with all his experience over many, many decades. Preet Gill MP, Shadow Cabinet Minister for International Development, who leads parliamentary efforts to hold the UK government to account and to focus on humanitarian and development issues. And just to warn you that she may have to disappear for a vote in the middle of this session. So if she does, please don't take it personally. And finally, I'm delighted to have a great friend of Save the Children and our work in East Africa, Guyo Roba, who's going to talk from first-hand experiences and has recently taken up a role as head of the Jameel Observatory based in Nairobi, which is focused on helping to make sure that we do learn those lessons of the past. We harness the data, the evidence, and develop models so we can act much more quickly based on forecasts to support families, children, and also support livestock losses, which we need to tackle as well. So in order to get the discussion going, we're going to hear from some of our speakers. I'm hoping the technology will support us. And first, hopefully, we'll hear from Rory Stewart in a pre-recorded interview. So without further ado, let me hope that plays.
The situation in Somalia is, of course, heartbreaking, and people get exhausted talking about the horror, but we just have to come back to real fundamentals, which is that nearly 250,000 people died in Somalia last time there was an extreme situation of this sort, which wasn't dealt with early. And this plays out, as you imagine, literally with babies dying in people's arms, with livestock dead, so nobody can feed themselves, and people moving through a landscape which is now probably about to go into its 5th year of drought. And the lessons really from when this has been done well, and actually the response in 2017 was better, is that you have to act early. You have to act before everything is exhausted, and we are getting very, very, very late. A little bit of support provided even a few months ago would have been able to keep some of that livestock alive, which would of course been able to produce some of the nutrition that people need to survive. And we're now in a world in which a G7 leaders conference is about to happen. There is a fantastic opportunity to bring people together, but we need to get the focus on the Horn of Africa and Somalia in particular. So many things distracted by Ukraine. There are tragedies in Afghanistan, tragedies in many other parts of the world, tragedies in Yemen, for example. But the situation in Somalia is one of the most extreme and unattended crises in the world, a place where literally hundreds of thousands of people will die unless we act, and where the United Kingdom government, speaking as a British citizen, has very sadly so far contributed far less than we have historically to these kinds of events. Historically, we would have found ourselves contributing in the hundreds of millions. We're now contributing as a government in the tens of millions, and that makes an enormous difference, the number of lives we can save. So this is really a plea for everybody to come together at the G7 Leaders Conference to put the focus on Somalia and a tragedy that we can see coming. Right? We can see that the last 2 years has been fatal. We can see that another drought will lead to tens of thousands of deaths, that we should act now. And to really begin to get the public and journalists and the media to concentrate as well on saving lives at a very difficult time.
Thank you very much, Rory. And as you say, it's a huge and really devastating situation, and we've been able to see it coming for several months. Why do you think it's not receiving the attention and the resources that it should be getting this time round?
I'm afraid that everybody's getting into a bit of a pessimistic spiral. There have been a number of crises, but one fundamental problem, I'm afraid to be brutal, is the British government decided to cut its development spend from spending 0.7% of its GDP to 0.5%. Doesn't sound like a big reduction, but unfortunately the reduction fell very, very hard on places like the Horn of Africa for complicated reasons. A lot of the money was pre-committed to different projects, which meant that there was much less available for this kind of thing. And this is really, in the most basic sense, where we are dealing with extreme poverty and its consequences at their most fatal. And if international development exists really for anything, or particularly the kind of development that we try to lead in DFID, it is on dealing with people who are in these situations of extreme destitution, extreme hunger. And Somalia should be the real example of a place where money can make an enormous difference. I mean, when it comes to running a nutrition center, keeping babies alive, small amounts of money really does save lives. It's not like these sort of complicated conversations that we get into on, whether we should be investing in rail infrastructure or road infrastructure. This is something where the impact is very, very direct and immediate.
So just picking up that point, obviously the UK is in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Lots of people are saying, we need to look after people at home. Obviously, Save the Children, we look after children in the UK and overseas. But how do we make that argument that despite the problems at home, we still have to help overseas?
I'm afraid the truth, certainly for me, and I'm sure for many other people, is that it's best seen directly through individual examples. My relationship to Somalia is very much sitting in a nutrition center and seeing a baby that had just been carried out of the desert, seeing a mother, one of whose babies has died and the other one of whom was just about making it through with 2 weeks of emergency feeding, and realizing that there are different types of poverty in the world. There's poverty has a big impact in Britain and has a big impact on people's lives. But in Somalia, we're talking about something much more extreme and much more fatal. We are literally talking about people, small infants dying, and not just small infants, adults too, who could be saved very, very easily. Literally, lives could be saved with a small amount of money.
It definitely rings true with me. I think, watching a child die of hunger is something that you never forget. And as you say, it's very little people, truly devastating. And we've obviously seen from the UK massive generosity on Ukraine. The DCPL has raised, more than ever before. People have been so generous wanting to help. How do we encourage that same kind of empathy, support for people on the Horn of Africa or on Somalia?
I think the most important thing is to convince people that it's going to make a practical and immediate difference. I'm afraid there is a sort of weariness that comes around. People get worried about corruption, they get worried about conflict, in the case of Ukraine, I think it felt to people more direct. Russia invaded. You could see more directly what had triggered the problem. In Somalia, I think people can feel a bit hopeless. They begin to worry, is my money going to make any difference? Doesn't this happen again and again? The truth is that actually a small amount of money can make more difference with people living in extreme poverty, because they are living in a world in which people are often living on $6 a month. I've come across cases of this very recently. So a small amount of money really can save lives. So we have to explain how much good can be done, how effective we can be, how that child's life can literally be saved, and move people on from a sort of slight academic conversation about, what is the future of international development? Why is Somalia in this situation in the first place? Down to the much more direct situation, which is we're not talking about large amounts of money here. We're talking about, in British terms, 5% of what we would spend on the winter fuel allowance, for example.
No, I agree. And we're definitely finding with the work we do is $20 a month keeps a family alive. And actually, for me, one of the most powerful things has been people we've been supporting for the last 2 years with that safety net actually are coping much better. So you mentioned the G7, and obviously we've got the G7 summit coming up. The UK last year, under its G7 presidency, launched a famine compact, saying we were going to do something on this. At Save the Children and Oxfam, we've done this dangerous delays report showing that we're just not acting fast enough. Even though we always say never again, it is happening again. So how do we get the G7 to realise this should be on the top of their global priorities and has a wider geopolitical impact?
Well, here I'm going to be a bit radical, and I imagine other speakers in our conversation may well disagree with me, and I'm happy to listen to those disagreements. I think we need to actually be much more open about finding other ways of delivering things. I'm a real believer, for example, in unconditional cash transfer. I think getting money to people's phones, and it's remarkable how much of the world, even in the most desperate places, you can get phones to people and get money onto people's phones, can make a huge difference because it gives them the chance to target where their needs really are. It brings their imagination, their freedom into play in working out how to deploy that money. You can do it much more cost effectively. You can cut out problems with government corruption. You can provide that resilience on the ground, and you can provide for the G7 essentially a number, which is to say that for about 0.1% of global GDP, we could effectively end extreme poverty and starvation around the world through direct cash transfer. So that's really what I would be trying to push if I was at the G7 summit.
Thank you very much, Rory. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. You've heard Rory's view on what we should be doing, where the challenges are, and we'll come back to our panelists as well with some questions, hopefully from the audience, about what their take is on those issues and others. But now I'm going to turn to Guyo Roba to talk about the work and what he's seen firsthand of his work in Kenya and through a career focusing on these issues of livelihood support and families struggling with hunger and malnutrition. So Guyo, over to you, please.
Thank you again, and thank you for having me as a panelist in this conversation today. Yeah, I'll quickly speak to just expound the severity of the crisis across Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia. I think just to underscore that in East Africa, currently we are facing a full-blown catastrophic drought situation. And I think across the three countries, we are at a crisis point, for lack of a better word. For a number of reasons, I think there are a number of statistics flying around to underscore the situation we are in right now. The first is the actual number of people facing hunger has more than doubled since last year, from 10 million to over 23 million in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And one person dies every 48 seconds from acute hunger as drought, displacement, and conflict combined take toll on people. Just coming closer to where I am in Kenya, 3.5 million people are suffering crisis levels of hunger, while I think UN prediction shows 350,000 Somali children may die from severe acute malnutrition by summer if nothing is done. I think it's very important, as earlier speakers mentioned, the Ukraine war has worsened this situation. The conflict has already caused wheat product to soar by almost 20% as we speak, because Ukraine and Russia combined account for almost 90% of our wheat supply in East Africa. What this particular reality explains or speaks to is that one is the deep fragility of our food supply chain in the region, and the second is the interconnectedness of the systems that millions of the population in this region rely on to survive. But coming to the reality of where we are right now, I can say the warnings were adequate, but we largely chose the path of inaction in the region for one reason or another. And this is emphasized in the reports that you already mentioned, which is Dangerous Delay Report 2, published by Oxfam Save the Children in partnership with the Jameel Observatory. I'll quickly speak to some of the key highlights from the report. It's very important, as you mentioned, to know that this report comes almost 10 years after the first report, which was done in 2011, when Somalia experienced a devastating famine that killed over a quarter million of people, half of them actually children under the age of 5. In the wake of that tragedy, leaders in the region made commitments to end drought emergencies by 2022. But then it is good to note that in the intervening years, there are considerable investments in the warning systems and initiatives targeted at resilience building. But however, as the report expounded, evaluations have consistently shown that early warning systems have not led to early actions, which is required urgently. So 10 years after the first report, the international community is again responding too late and with too little to avert the crisis in 2022. And you have to underscore that despite the clear, repeated, credible warnings of impending crisis. So what this implies that the failure is not a warning system, it's not about the warning system, but rather a failure of political will and commitment to handle the anger issues. Looking at the current trend, the number of disasters will actually annually increase globally from approximately 400 in 2015 to about 560 by 2030. And what this means is that purely responsive systems will not be able to prepare or respond to challenges in the years to come. The additional disturbing reality is about funding. And I'll say two things about the funding. One is generally the funding is a problem. So far, we have just raised about 2%, which is $93 million of the current $4.4 billion US annual UN appeal to provide life-saving assistance to almost 30 million people in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And coming closer home, this funding to the local and national responders remain far too low. I think as 2020, it shows less than 5% of the global humanitarian funds available to local and national responders. And as I come closer to finishing my submission, although the report underscored the importance of taking actions in expectation of a crisis, what we call anticipatory action, which is more cost-effective than responding to late-stage humanitarian crisis, national and global responses have largely failed to act preemptively. So today, pastoralist and agro-pastoralist communities are largely in the teeth of crisis, and they urgently need funding for humanitarian response to save life. The report highlighted two key recommendations. One is the changes in both the systems around anticipatory action and how it is financed. And secondly, it calls for an increase of the contingency budget and simplification of that budget to allow for rapid deployment. As I think it's very important to note that flexibility, reliability, and multi-year funding is very key in tackling, protracted crisis of hunger. As I conclude, there are specific roles for the UK government in tackling hunger crisis, including in the forthcoming G7 Leaders Summit. The first one is urgently commit additional financing towards the UN humanitarian response plan for the Horn of Africa. And secondly, set up and tackle the root causes of food insecurity and accelerate locally led anticipatory action to prevent further crisis. This will include prioritizing funding for local and national organizations that was really emphasized in the Dangerous Delay report. And lastly, to ensure a return to the spending of 0.75% of gross national income on aid as soon as practically possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot of issues in there we will come back to in the questions, because I think you make some really important points. Preet Gill has disappeared for a vote, in case anyone noticed. She'll be back very shortly. But next, can I turn to Mark Lowcock? Mark, we've seen some of these challenges before. What's new? What's not new, please?
Well, thanks very much, Gwen, and congratulations to you and Oxfam on the report, and thank you for putting on this event. As you know, I worked on the 1992 famine in Somalia. I was in Baidoa and Mogadishu. I was also closely involved in the failed response in 2011, and very closely involved actually in the much better response in 2017. So it breaks my heart to see all this coming around again, I have to say, in Somalia and the wider Horn. I think it's really important just to start by saying that this is part of the world's worst global food crisis for many decades. It's right that we've got this focus on the Horn and Somalia, but there's many other very vulnerable countries, and we need to keep them in mind as well, because some of them are right on the cusp of famine, and there's actually a larger number of places we've seen for a long time where loss of life running into the millions is more than possible. It is still possible, though, to prevent a global tragedy of historic proportions, but the clock is ticking, and we need a lot more serious action very, very quickly than we've seen so far. The UK, I'm afraid, has behaved in a totally shameful way on this in recent years. I think the decision by the government in the pandemic to balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world was an abhorrent thing to do. And I think it's wrong to talk about UK leadership in this area. The UK is not a leader. The UK is a laughing stock among the wider world on the way we've been responding to these issues. What we should aspire to at the moment is at least better UK followership, because there are still ideas that have been developed and generated in the UK which are relevant in this crisis. And if at least our government could be better followers of those, for example, like the Biden administration, who have really stepped up in the last month, putting an extra $5 billion on the table for global food crisis, then that would be a modest positive step, somewhat to redress the the appalling decisions we've seen taken over the last 2 or 3 years, which, by the way, are widely mocked and ridiculed in the wider world. This has been very damaging for Britain's international reputation, it's important that our leaders understand that, and understand that when they talk about leading in this area, people roll their eyes and laugh. And the effect is further to reduce Britain's the respect in which Britain is held on these issues. But I would want to flag 3 specific things that I think need to happen to deal with this current set of challenges. The first is there is an urgent need for substantially additional humanitarian assistance to the big agencies now. And to pick up something Rory Stewart said, the more of that money that can be provided in the form of cash to families who have no means of income, the better. One of the really positive features of the 2017 response in Somalia was that 600,000 families were given purchasing power by text message, using the model actually, which was first developed actually with DFID support through M-Pesa in Kenya in about 10 or 15 years ago. And so 3 million people in those 600,000 families were basically saved by being given purchasing power in text messages, and they could take the voucher they got in the text and redeem it for grain in the local market. And that worked all over the country. And that was a really positive part of the response, and it's not too late to do that on a large scale in Somalia and other countries now. The second thing is I want to pick up what Guyo was saying about anticipatory action. For some humanitarian disasters, you get 10 seconds notice. You get 10 seconds notice of an earthquake. But for a drought, you get months of notice. And there's enormous scope to use the kind of tools we use in other areas of public policy to act earlier. Kenya actually has a very good livestock drought insurance system for farmers, which is triggered by satellite data information on projected poor pastures and harvests. And using insurance techniques and using contingency financing tools and bringing together the combination of data, pre-agreed money, and a pre-prepared plan, all of which gets triggered much earlier, can get you not just a much more effective response, but a much cheaper response. Now, a lot of the ideas in this space, in fact, have been developed by British institutions, and it's really shameful that the current government is totally failing to put money behind those ideas, which would save a lot of lives much more cheaply than having to use very, very expensive last-minute interventions by providing plumpina or intravenous fluids to children who should never have been allowed to get to the point where they'll die without those interventions. So that anticipatory action area is an area of huge potential, and it's supremely ironic that the country which generated a lot of those ideas and tested them and piloted them is now abandoning them. I think it's a really, really shameful situation the current government has put Britain into. The third area then I want to emphasize picks up something that Rory said, and that is we need to rethink the whole of the international development system so that it is focused much more heavily and in a much more serious way in this group of countries which remain extremely fragile and conflict affected. I'm going to be 60 next month, and the life experience of the average human being on the planet while I've been alive has been completely transformed from a situation where most people on the planet when I was born lived lives of extreme poverty. They were hungry all the time. They watched their kids die in infancy. They never went to school. Life expectancy in most places was not much more than half of what it is now. That has fallen from more than 50% to less than 10%. So huge change is possible, but the problem is some countries and some people have been left behind. And what we need to do is to refocus the World Bank and the IMF and the UN and all those other institutions so that they focus largely, principally, on those countries that have been left behind. They stop providing most of their resources, as is the case at the moment, to countries which have already developed a long way, and they focus instead on those that haven't. And then we'll be able to move to a point where what we're dealing with is causes, not symptoms. At the moment, all we're dealing with is symptoms in these crises, and it's dealing with the symptoms of something and not its causes is a surefire recipe for failure. And again, Britain used to have a prominent role in shaping the policy priorities of these international development institutions, and coming forward with some of these ideas now would at least be good followership, given that we have abandoned totally our previous role of trying to play a leadership role.
Thank you very much, Mark, and lots in there as well that we will come back to. But thanks very much to Preet Gill for rejoining us after the vote. Can I turn to you for your perspective on these issues, please?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Gwen. And it's absolutely, I'm so delighted to be joining such a brilliant panel and, listen to some of those contributions. But I think it's already been said, the global hunger crisis is really on the brink of becoming a catastrophe in the Horn of Africa. As Guyo said, someone is actually dying every 48 seconds. And in Somalia alone, 300,000 children are on the verge of famine. 15 million are experiencing severe hunger every single day. And it's the worst food crisis of the 21st century, but hardly anyone is talking about it. And somehow the figures and the statistics that I've just shared, none of us should become complacent. And unfortunately, with so much that's going on, not just here in our country, but of course the government lurching from crisis to crisis, you can sort of wonder why some of this goes over people. And that's why it's incumbent on us to be raising and keep talking about these issues. And that's why today's event is really, really important. I mean, from the government's perspective, I think you can understand really why they don't want to talk about it. I mean, seeing millions of East Africans on the verge of starving to death, yet they've done absolutely next to nothing to respond. And as you said, we've known about this for the last 2 years. It's like we want to wait for the dire situation to occur before we actually even react. And by then, for some, it's way, way too late. But we've seen it time and again. So it's not just East Africa, is it? In the case of Afghans fleeing, from the Taliban last year, or whether it's people of Ukraine fleeing Vladimir Putin's senseless war, it's the British people that have actually stepped up in terms of the emergency. 150,000 people offered their homes to Ukrainian refugees. The Disasters Emergency Committee broke world records for the speed and the scale, really, of the public response. And so that solidarity that we saw from the British public was really, really heartening. But seeing the horrific scenes in East Africa, children reduced to skin and bones, most people actually would be moved to act. And, the poll by Christian Aid found that actually 23% of the British public were aware of the crisis, while 91% were actually aware of the conflict in Ukraine. And at the moment, that really suits our government just fine, because it's a political choice not to act. It's why we have got to talk about these issues as much as we can. Yes, there's a bandwidth problem. Ukraine has, as everybody else has said, has rightly occupied the international attention as a cause not just Putin's barbarity, but for the very principle of democracy and human rights. And when it comes to our government, we can be under no illusions, really, that their silence is pretty much a political choice. Aid to Somalia has been cut by more than 80% in 2 years, even as 300,000 children face starvation. I don't think any of us can reconcile how these decisions can be made, given what we've known for the last 2 years. And aid to Ethiopia has been reduced by over 85%. And the sum committed so far this year absolutely represent a fraction of what we actually need. And everyone knows my views on the aid cuts. They're short-sighted, politically motivated to cut the overseas aid budget. I think it was a profound mistake, but it's really much, much worse than that. The government chose to shut our world-leading Department for International Development, navel-gazing at a time of unprecedented global crisis. And when it signed off that decision, as the Dangerous Delay report actually highlights, the warning signs were actually already there. And that's why this does not sit comfortably with me at all. Worse again, it's eroded our development clout by delivering stealth cuts, by overpricing surplus vaccine donations against an aid budget that doesn't have a penny to spare. Of course, we saw the cuts from 0.7 to 0.5, and it's broken its promises and hampered really the UK's ability to galvanise action on the world stage. It is part of why the UN appeal for the Horn of Africa is so drastically underfunded at less than 5%. And the government has pretty much sidelined development politically. It no longer has a seat around the cabinet table. Liz Truss is distracted picking fights with the EU and 2 other briefs. And even then, I still think she wishes she was doing international trade. But in its obsession with picking fights and playing the politics of division, our government has no interest in governing. And to be honest, it's more a Boris Johnson self-preservation society. But the result of this, it's the result of the lack of leadership that is a concern, because utterly incomprehensible decisions such as baking in a 35% cut to the humanitarian aid budget while East Africa starves, Ukraine is bombed to bits, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and are all seemingly forgotten. And the abject failure to lead on the international stage has consequences because it costs people their lives. I mean, it's pretty much as simple as that. I'm clear, though, that under Labour, we will rebuild Britain's development expertise, we will restore our commitment to 0.7, and with it, Britain's reputation as a reliable international partner focused on the global challenges facing us all. This is the bedrock on which any effective international development strategy and any response to humanitarian emergency as fast as the Horn of Africa hunger crisis must stand. But the challenges it presents go much, much deeper than that. Even before Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, global food security was weak, whether you live in Shipley or Sudan. We all have an interest in tackling this issue. This is where the divisive government gets it so fundamentally wrong. An estimated 3 billion people cannot afford enough healthy food, a function both of the high costs of a nutritious diet as well as pervasive income inequality. Climate change is multiplying the risk of harvest failures, large-scale infrastructural damage, mass migration and conflict, creating the conditions for high and volatile food prices and food shortages. Looking ahead, prices could rise even further if high fertilizer prices reduce planting and other major wheat-producing regions are unable to fill the shortfall, or God forbid, if there's a significant harvest failure in another breadbasket region, such as India, where extreme heat is currently pummeling its billion-strong population. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape is shifting and multilateralism is waning. The UK's international development strategy weakens and will cut support to our multilateral system, marking a further retreat just at a moment when we need international cooperation more than ever. And to identify alternative food sources, to galvanise international investment and drive transformative action on climate change, agricultural reform and more, on the biggest challenges we face, Britain can't go it alone. But when Boris Johnson goes to Kigali for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting this week, how will he be received when his government is turning its back on Africa? How, when G7 leaders meet next week, will we get the action plan we need with a Prime Minister representing us who has not only undermined but betrayed his own pledges to the world's poorest from the G7 in Cornwall last year? One of the greatest food price shocks of the past few decades was in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2007. The then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, led the world in galvanizing action from the G20 to stabilize the world economy. Where is that ambition now? And the easy thing to do would be to be despair, it would be to turn inwards, but we've got to come together at times of crisis. We've done it before and we can do it again. And during the drought of 2011, 260,000 people died in Somalia, half of them children under 5. In 2017, stronger action from the international community, of course, averted that repeat. And with those moments in mind, we should find the confidence to demand more of our leaders now. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of opportunity for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And a few questions coming in already, and plenty I've got as well. But first, to take a question from John Plasto from Oxfam. And Mark, I'm going to turn to you, because this is certainly something that we're struggling with. The generosity of the British public on the Ukraine conflict to those displaced within Ukraine and in other countries as well, including the UK, is fantastic. When I look at the DEC appeal, it's brought in over £350 million from the public. Yet Afghanistan is about 40 million. Many other crises, we haven't even got a DEC appeal yet in terms of the hunger crisis. And as you say, it's not just Somalia. So should we be bolder as the UN system, as charities such as Save the Children, say, actually, no, we're going to stop taking money for Ukraine, and we're going to really try and put resources into Somalia instead. And of course, with the UK aid budget as well, given it's fixed, it does become this zero-sum game. What would you do?
Well, I do think it's really shameful to reinforce the cuts that were made, as Preet Gill has just said, to humanitarian budgets in 2020 and 2021 by shifting more money further from starving children in Somalia to Ukraine. I think it's right. We must help the Ukrainians. Actually, the best way to help them, beyond helping them to defend themselves from Putin's brutal aggression, is to support their economy. And again, the US have shown a lead there, putting billions of dollars on the table to support the Ukrainian economy so that they can keep their public services going, they can keep paying pensions, they can keep their social security systems going. It's not a success measure for a country to get to the point where the only way people can be kept going is by relying on the work of the international humanitarian agencies. Those agencies can play an important role, but we shouldn't be aspiring to that route as the way to help Ukraine. We should help the Ukrainian institutions and support the Ukrainian economy. Now, I do think there's a very interesting choice for the sector on how you communicate to the public about the best use of resources that are now available. And I think it would be a good idea, actually, to pick up what the Biden administration have been saying to themselves and to Congress, that the biggest loss of life arising from what Putin has done will be the millions facing starvation because of the global food crisis. As more people understand that, they will agree that there should be support for those people, mostly out of a moral and empathetic generosity, but also because people understand that if those people don't get any help, they will be forced to flee. And, Africa is 8 miles from Europe. That exodus will destabilize the countries where it happens firstly, then the wider region, and then the wider world. So it's not just an issue of empathy, it's also an issue of our own national interest that ought to get us marching faster towards avoiding this total catastrophe that's currently playing out.
Thank you very much. And Guyo, and a different question for you. Obviously, with the Jameel Observatory, we're looking at anticipatory action, and you talked about the benefits of that, and obviously the report goes into it in detail. And with the support of the Community Jameel Foundation, we're harnessing data, both international and also local data that people have. But there's a question here from George Mayenga about, what about political will? You can design great policies, great promises, but what happens in reality? Maybe something else because of political will. And some examples about the Galana irrigation scheme in Kenya, and how do we ensure that we factor in that political economy analysis to what's actually happening, and think about the governance issues behind what happens or doesn't happen in Kenya, in Somalia, in other countries too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a very good question from George. When we started because in Jameel Observatory, we work through the community of practice, which are basically institutions that are already busy in that space. So we started questioning some of our fundamental thinking on where do we start from. And initially, I think our thinking was built so much on the data, and we realized actually data is just a small part of the problem. And that goes to the bigger part, which now George raised. But I think just to answer him, there's a lot happening already in this space, quite busy space. And I think, to me, for us to handle the issue around policy, we need to improve on the systems that is already existing. You know, Kenya, for example, has the national level systems through the Kenya Food Security Steering Groups, the county level systems that is actually coordinating the same with the national level, but I think fairly disjointed. So I think what it means is that we have an opportunity of looking at some of these gaps and see how do we tighten this gap. And we've already started thinking through our, our work at the observatory by raising some of the challenge questions. Challenge questions are questions that are very practical from the actors who are part of the community of practice, and they've been dealing with this wicked problem for quite a long time. So they raise some of the fundamental questions around coordination, around short-term versus long-term interventions, the issues around financing for anticipatory actions. So we have already 5 to 6 challenge questions. And these questions fundamentally forms the part of the starting point for us to question what is the system currently we're using and how do we improve on that. And I think the other level, which I think Kenya has taken a good step, is around establishing a very strong legislation on putting in some pool fund, so that I think you can pool others around issues around funding. If the government is at the center of all this through the National Drought Management Authority, then they have more ground to pull others to coordinate this funding. And I think that is a very good thing. It's just legislation which has been passed a year or two and gaining traction. So hopefully they'll put the 2 billion shilling for anticipatory action, and that I think safeguards us to provide funding when it is required along the cycle. The other one is, I think, is the coordination mechanism among diverse actors is one of the weakest link in all this game. And this is something we need to think through, and how do we strengthen these, these gaps through our exploring this challenge question. Hopefully some of them will be full-blown project as the question develops, and one of our hope is that we will have a challenge sponsor, basically a challenge question sponsor, which is an institution that stand largely to benefit from some of these questions. And so it's not an easy thing to do, but I think there's opportunity for exploring this through our platform, which is the community of practice, to have more relevant questions, more demand-led questions, and explore some of these issues in the long run.
Thank you so much, Guyo. And just to follow up in terms of the work, I remember when we first talked about it and working with the University of Edinburgh and Ilri about livestock, and of course Save the Children works with children. Why are those two things related in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think livestock, because predominantly where we work is a dry land space, which is a multifunctional landscape with a lot of variability in space and time and resources. So livestock become the integral asset that people, use or people keep for sustaining themselves and their livelihood. And I think children and partly women are also among the most affected category of people by drought. And I think statistics are already shown in what I presented in Somalia. And I think in the report, although I didn't mention in the dangerous daily report, women are also disproportionately affected by this. So I think the link is in that livestock is the center of production systems that majority depend on. And I think children, largely because of the the milk uptake and other nutritional need from the livestock, becomes an integral part of the system that we need to work on, and I think we need to keep an eye on.
Thank you so much. So Mark, I'm going to come back to you, and you stressed this really is a global crisis with over 200 million people. We've seen a perfect storm of COVID, conflict, climate change all coming together. And certainly we're seeing just the challenge of which response do we deal with, and certainly we've introduced a pooled fund so we can respond to the crises that don't even make the news. In your old job, you were trying to look across the world and so on, but the scale of the crises and the amount of resources gets ever harder to match up. How do we balance that competing set of demands and supply which don't match up?
Well, the reason that the needs are growing is because we're dealing with symptoms, not causes. And the combination of growing conflict and the impact of climate change and COVID has made too many countries much more vulnerable. The only way out of that is to develop. And that's why we need to refocus the international development system on helping those 30 or 40 countries who haven't enjoyed the development story, the development success story, arguably the greatest achievement in human history over the last 60 years that more than 100 countries have enjoyed. We need to bring those other countries along. And so that's the only way out. There's no other way out of this dilemma. Now, in the meantime, it is really important when you have multiple crises to try to make sure you're paying attention to all of them. The reason 250,000 people lost their lives in Somalia in 2011 was partly that too many people were distracted by other problems, in particular the Arab Spring that year. Now, when I was, as you say, Gwen, in my last job, we had something called the Central Emergency Response Fund. It was a pot of money invented actually largely by Hilary Benn, who used to be the Secretary of State for Development in DFID from 2003 to 2007. And he put it in place in the wake of the 2004 tsunami. And at the beginning of the year, there was something like $450 million in that pot. And that pot of money I could use to be the first source of funds to respond to every new crisis. I didn't have to ring anyone up when the crisis hit. I could just allocate the money straight away. Now, when I was at the UN, we grew that pot of money from $450 million the first year I was there to 850 in my fourth year. And that was largely because of British and German and other Scandinavian decisions that they saw this was an effective fund, and it was dealing increasingly with anticipatory action, which is, I think, a really key area that we've touched on. And that meant that some crises that weren't being paid attention to got dealt with quickly and easily. So let me give you an example. In Madagascar, there was an outbreak of plague in 2017. People thought there would be thousands of cases and it would be exported around the region. Because I provided just $1 million from that fund without having to ask anybody or make 28 phone calls to get the money, just $1 million meant there were not thousands of cases, but hundreds, and it didn't spread to any other country. Now, another example of the shameful consequences of the decisions Boris Johnson's government has made is that Central Emergency Response Fund is not $850 million anymore, it's $500 million. And so you don't get that early action anymore. And the likelihood of having crises that are not responded to at all therefore goes up.
No, I remember the days well, and as Save the Children, we've done the similar pooled funds so that we can respond. And of course, we have things like the Start Fund, which also act really early as well. So Preet, if I can come back to you in terms of one of the challenges driving this, of course, is climate change. We have a new set of negotiations going on at the moment. How do we make sure that there is action on climate change and that there is funding going to places like the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, who are being affected through either humanitarian or climate funding, but some kind of funding to help them to cope?
I mean, this is a huge frustration because we saw what happened at COP26, that 100 billion finance is just, that can has been kicked down the road. And the year of our COP27 presidency, I don't think we did enough early on to really sort of mobilize that coalition of countries to really come out and take action. Of course, the aid cuts have really impacted on, you know, trust, for example. You know, everybody I've spoken to in the Global South saw the aid cuts as a retreat. And of course, you know, those countries can block agreements at COP26. So you're not going to get the success. We're not going to be able to hit the targets that we need to hit. I mean, 99% of all the deaths from sort of weather-related disasters actually affect the world's 50 least developed countries, but yet they've contributed, what, less than 1% of global carbon emissions? I mean, how is that actually fair? So you can, when I was talking to climate activists from the Global South, they were really, really frustrated and angry. And sort of, you know, the government wants to think that actually the aid cuts haven't really made a difference and actually everything is okay. They've really had, I would say, deep impact. So I think, you know, we've really got to mobilize those developed countries around that were there for Paris Agreement 2015. And that means we've got to deliver our promises made to those developing countries, including that 100 billion of finance. I don't want to see it as loans like we have been seeing. There's got to be grants being made. I mean, that's certainly something that, you know, activists were saying to me from Global South countries. I just think it's appalling. And given what's happening in the world, it seems like climate has just taken a step back. And yet, you know, we're going to be meeting in Egypt in November later this year, not hearing anything from government on climate and the urgency and the speed by which we're trying to galvanize and bring countries together.
Thank you. And Guyo, I have a question for you, which is a tricky one. Around the UN and its reputation, from somebody who's working in Mogadishu with the UN and saying, we're seeing these horrific statistics, you know, children, 356,000 children who just may not make it to the end of September. And yet, as you've said, as Mark has said, as others have said, you know, a small amount of money, a small amount of food can make the difference between life and death. And yet we have a big international system, people living off international salaries and so on as well. Does the UN, I broaden that to the international system reputation, does that make it harder to actually get money to help the people who really need it?
Very hard question, but I think I'll try. I think the UN still has a space because I think it's arguably one of the global neutral institutions that can push agenda. I think it's also important to note the influence of the UN, actually, because I come from the UN before I came here from IFAD, has been diminishing actually over the years. And one, I think, is also the funding issue. All UN agencies are struggling with their, you know, funding to maintain what the participant mentioned as maintaining, you know, heavy workforce and etc. But I think reputational issue aside, I think if the UN put the best foot forward and say, I think we will have to act on this and try to raise the red flag in different you know, dialogue, I feel still they have an opportunity of doing that. And because I think up to now, I haven't seen in the region, of course, they can work with the regional blocks like the AU and the rest to raise the flag on some of these issues. But I think my thinking is that they still have a very good space to push this agenda forward. I'm actually this coming week, I'm attending this fifth dialogue run by Africa Union, developing a roadmap for anticipatory action. And I think there are similar initiatives in the UN, I guess. And I think our meeting point is how much do we invest in this agenda going forward, forgetting about, you know, the past and where we're standing right now, they still remain valuable in the future dialogue and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well answered. It's a tricky one. So just for a final question for our panelists, in terms of how do we make the public aware of this and care about it? So Preet, with your constituents over coming weeks, how do we make people care, and ideally before it turns into those devastating images of children, which, as Mark said, should never have to go through the pain and suffering of needing nutritious paste, drips and so on as well? How do we make people care now?
I mean, look, there isn't just enough media coverage. You've got to understand, where do people get their sources of information? Is it social media? Do they watch the news? You know, just understanding the demographic, you know, is really, really important. And of course, diaspora communities generally know more so because they've got direct contact from in country. They'll be speaking to people regularly. So for me, you know, I'm going to urge the sector yet again, mobilize your membership, mobilize that support to be writing to MPs, to be talking about it. I've been speaking to students. I'm very lucky. I've got the University of Birmingham in my constituency. I can go and speak to students. I want them to care about development and to understand why it's important as to we make the case for development. I think one of the biggest things has been, though, in the last decade, is we haven't taken the British public with us as to why that's been important. How does it meet Britain's interests? As Mark alluded to, if there's a mass exodus of people because of the economic collapse in Afghanistan, where do you think those people are going to be coming? They're going to try and cross the Channel crossing. It should not actually be that way. It costs much less by supporting people where they are. And people want a stake in their futures. You know, when I went to Afghanistan, people weren't saying to me, we want to be relying on handouts. What they were saying to me, I want a job. I want what you want for your child. I want the safety, the security, the access to education. I want to be part of the future of Afghanistan. And, you know, we've got a real responsibility to stop tiptoeing around this subject because it feels uncomfortable, or we worry about what people's views are. And we've got to learn to have honest conversations with the British public as to what matters and why it's important actually that Britain does step up and it plays its part in the world. The British public are hugely you know, giving, and they've shown that level of solidarity. How are we going to make sure we continue to build on that post-COVID and make sure that we continue to make the case for development? This is not going to be the only pandemic we've faced with. It's not the only catastrophe. There'll be future you know, preparedness around global health that we've got to do. So as much as we can have these conversations, in my own family, you know, huge amounts of diaspora, we send remittances, we do our own development in the ways that, you know, many diaspora communities do. I think we need to start talking to them and engaging with them and finding out what it is that they do. You know, I couldn't believe it. I read a statistic the other day that said, of the remittances that the British public is sending back to countries, 7.1 billion is paid in fees alone. I mean, you know, that's quite interesting because in many respects, it's the diaspora communities that are doing development. And they're almost paying for our development budget. So actually, we've got to be able to make the case, and we've got to have those important conversations and never stop talking. One of the heartening things since the government did the institutional vandalism of taking over the department and thinking that actually that they were going to stoke these culture wars, nobody has stopped talking about development. It's been in the media every single week, and it's heartening to see that actually we do care. And those are the voices that we need to amplify. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll be sharing our petition and asking people to sign it, please, to put some pressure on the Prime Minister. And also, please do write to your MP if you're listening. You'll also see some adverts in the UK and around G7 capitals as well. We're taking a new approach, but definitely diaspora and other connections. Mark and Guyo, and Mark, a final quick word.
Yeah, I mean, people do care when they're aware. That's what you learn every time you have this conversation with people. So the challenge is a communications challenge primarily, I think. It's really important to communicate not just the problem, but the fact that there's a solution. And if you don't deal with the problem, it's going to get worse. So this is not difficult to understand. And when you join up the logic with people's empathy, you find there's a lot of support for doing the right thing.
Thank you. Guyo, a final word from you?
Yeah, I think without repeating what my colleagues mentioned, I think for me, it should also start with our own individual government in taking leadership on some of these issues. I think a very, very good example is Kenya. You know, by the time we flagged drought as a disaster, it's very, very late. And I think we would have done a lot. And that, I think, boils down to the communication and whose voice counts in the whole flagging issue. So I think, to me, going forward, getting the right voice with the right people and the right perspective is very critical. in both planning for contingency, for budgeting, and how that budgeting is, is released to people. And I think at the beginning we mentioned, how the money goes to the right people. This is an important question in all our countries in the region. We have to address this governance issue and how money flows to the right people. Is basically what mechanism do we have in terms of the social safety net that allows people to have money in their pocket, to have better purchasing power in the face of some of these issues, because all the assets that they have, the livestock is neither productive nor actually cannot be sold at a given time. So I think it's a combination of all these things that somehow has to be discussed at the policy level. And I think we need to have a policy fix. And I think we need to walk the talk as government in the region to lead this conversation, so that I think anybody who could come definitely will be helpful at some point. But I think my point is I'm emphasizing that the leadership should come from the individual government in the region.
Thank you so much. And just to quote Guyo at a recent event we did together, he talked about how often humanitarian aid workers come with the vultures. And the challenge is, can we come before the vultures and actually help children, help families before it's too late? And I think that's a really important message for all of us to take away. And thank you very much to all our panelists, to Rory in his absence, to all of you for your ideas, for your commitment, for all the work you've done over the years, and to everybody listening, thank you very much for some great questions. And I'm sure this is very much a conversation and an action plan to be continued. Thank you very much and goodbye.